Welcome to students and teachers to another episode of the Constitution in American Life. This is our second episode of this season, summer-fall season. So we just want to keep you abreast of some really important breaking news in the world today, and that is always Major League Baseball and the rivalries and contests that are going on. Last night, I was entertained by a stream of text messages between a grumpy Brewer fan and sorrowful Chicago Cub fan as they were battling out to a 1-0 win by the Cubbies there, who took 2 of 3 from the Brewers in this last series, and they're still hanging on to a possible wild card position here. So we'll always keep you informed here about Major League Baseball, because each one of our of the FOPs here are diehard baseball fans and believe that it truly is a piece of Americana. Maybe the only thing that I agree with George Will on is about the role of baseball in American society. So last week, or I can't remember exactly when it was, maybe it was this week, we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech from August of 1963. And gentlemen, I'm just real curious, kind of real quickly, I want to kind of check in with you, and I'm on a few things about that event. And I'm wondering, do you guys think that speech has been overblown in our popular historical culture, that we put way too much emphasis, and in fact, such emphasis that tends to reveal that we have very little knowledge about its context? Mike, you want to jump on that? Do you think we put too much emphasis on that event and that speech?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that King had some very important things to say after the speech, and some later speeches that don't get as much play. Well, I don't think most Americans know the whole story of that rally, and how that rally was an idea that had been around for two decades. That King did that with a lot of other people, and that the "I Have a Dream" part at the end was actually spontaneous. I mean, King kind of felt the speech was kind of losing some steam, and it was, I forget who behind him said, "Martin, tell him about the dream you have," because he would do that in churches. He'd talk about the dream. So that whole bit at the end was just kind of off the cuff, and it became something that is popular, and it's appeasing, right? It's something that can make, I think, all of us feel good about America, which is good. But if you look at some of his later speeches about poverty and economic inequality, he had some much harsher things to say about American society and about where things have gone, that we don't hear those speeches as much.
Chris or Tim?
I would agree. I think there's this story behind how the march came together is really a story that needs to be told. And that last impromptu section of where he gets into the "I Have a Dream," which is really kind of rehashing some of his other prior messages that, as Mike said, he'd been delivering. I think on that day, I would encourage students to check out the speech by a very young John Lewis.
Yeah.
And he was newly elected leader of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. And he was really kind of like I don't say a disciple, but certainly a follower of nonviolence. But he was talked to by the elders that were putting that together and said, "You need to tone this down because we need this to be a unifying event." I think I've become frustrated because we currently see the content of their character and not the color of their skin. This seems to be the only section of the speech that some people seem to recognize, and they try to use that. And Mike is really on point. Folks need to go and look at what Dr. King was saying later. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any boots. Mm-hmm. And I would encourage students, if you're not, and I'm sure your teachers that are teaching this program are well aware, I'd much rather recommend A Letter from Birmingham Jail. I think that's one of the most valuable pieces of American rhetoric that you could read. So I Have a Dream speech, very important in American history. The March for, and remember the name of the March for Jobs and Freedom, Jobs and Freedom. I think that's important. But I would tell kids to check out A Letter from Birmingham Jail. Very powerful.
Yeah.
Professor Moore, any thoughts?
I think it is justifiably in the pantheon because I mean, crowd size, man. I mean, Woodstock. We always talk about these big events, and so I think the fact that there's by some estimates over, I think 600,000, 700,000 people there watching that speech. So I think I just think the sheer numbers begs is a pretty convincing argument that it should be considered. But I mean I do think Chris's point about Lewis's speech, there was a speech he didn't give. And Mike's point about the later economic speeches after he moves north into Chicago, I think it was. But I would say yes.
Well, and just I'm sorry, Dave, just to support Tim, a guy we've mentioned many times, constitutional scholar Akil Amar, close personal friend of Professor Moore's. He talks about America's unwritten constitution, and he cites like 5 different things, and that the "I Have a Dream" speech is one of the things that he cites. So, I mean, I would not disagree with that.
Well, it's nice to know that Professor Moore still believes that size matters here. So that's insight. And one thing I did want to point out is, again, because we're all lifelong learners, is the role of Bayard Rustin. He was the organizer of this, and I mean, I've read a few things regarding his impact, but because of his, I guess back then they call it lifestyle or whatever. He was clearly on the outer rings of that movement, although he played a significant role over the years. And I don't know if you guys saw that the first film production by the Obamas. Their company is a film on Bayard Rustin that's coming out here soon, so that should be very interesting. So today we're going to be talking about a subject that very much is central to, I think, MLK and the "I Have a Dream" speech, and that is voting rights. We will be addressing the context and purpose of the Voting Rights Act, as well as whether or not the Voting Rights Act still has relevance here in the 2020s. So let's start our discussion with our resident historian, and that is Professor Moore from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tim, I was hoping that you could provide some context background here. If America is the greatest democracy, as I hear people tell me in the world, why would we need a Voting Rights Act if voting, as some have said, is a fundamental right and we are all equal under the law?
Wow.
Insert sarcasm here. I'm sorry.
No. I think recently you made a very, very good point about, sometimes these questions that you have, kids, you can take exception to the premise. I think there's 3 things in your question, David, that I think may be assailable. Greatest, democracy, and fundamental right. Now I'll resist the urge to address those, but I mean, in some ways it's classic. It's classic David Richmond putting that out there for the purpose.
So I don't think I have an ownership or a monopoly on this.
Well,
all I have to do is turn on cable news, and I'm told every day that we live in the greatest democratic society ever known to man. So, well, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think all right, now that I'm through my snark phase, I think, well, the founders obviously were I'm kind of the spectrum guy. The founders were on a spectrum in their attitudes towards democracy. Some were leery of it, some of them were a little past leery, suspicious, and some were just downright hostile. And most were not embracing democracy. They had just come through the 1780s, where, according to Woody Holton, a great early American historian, there were excesses of democracy, too much democracy at the state level. And so there needed to be filters. So I think the founders' general overall attitude towards democracy was one of, from a distance to outright hostility. I mean, I was just reading an essay or an article, a manuscript today. Gouverneur Morris is writing from Paris, and he's comparing the crappiness of American democracy as well as what he's seeing in French democracy. So, I mean, it just is like, it's a 6-page letter of him on a rant about democracy. So my first point would be that the founders are not big fans of small d democracy. And two, even if they're going to tip their hat and acknowledge there has to be some democratic principles within our system, Madison creates this filtered system where there's no direct democracy. And even the direct democracy they do have in the House, the ratios are so beyond what everybody else thought good democracy should be, and the lack of annual elections. And so Madison comes along and kind of takes that suspicion and codifies it in the Constitution. I think also there's two fundamental principles that we don't think about at all today, and one we recoil against. I think the founders really believed that there was a paternalism in the way they thought about participation in democracy. That elites, and that just doesn't mean rich, but those that the natural aristocracy, as many of them would call it, should be deferred to in political power, and that their power, they could be trusted in that power. For the most part, folks are supposed to kind of defer. So there's an element of paternalism in play, I think, at the founding. But also, I think, most importantly, they believed in something that we called investiture. People should not have the right to vote if they weren't independent. And for them, it meant, did they have independent means? If you didn't have that independent means, or you weren't vested in society, my phrase is, I use the phrase thick and thin. You could not really be a proper citizen if you weren't vested or had a thick relationship within the community. So, and property is the easy one there, by which your vestiture was gauged. And also, it wasn't just property too. Sometimes it was just, can you pay taxes? Were you on the tax rolls? So there was always some kind of money or property or something of value associated with you being vested. Therefore, you should have the right to have these democratic inputs.
Well, and again, I think it's important we understand that the framers' perspective on voting and voting rights. But over time, by the time we get to the mid 20th century, we've got a 15th Amendment and a 19th Amendment, which seem to imply this right to vote. I don't know if it's fundamental right, but a right to vote. We have clearly become more small d democratic culturally there. And so I guess my question is, if victory in World War II kind of reinforces our wonderful role. I guess my question is, if we've got those amendments and we've got this small d democratic, cultural, development, why do we need a Voting Rights Act in 1965?
Well, I think, I know certainly Chris and certainly Michael can do a lot better job on this, but my glib answer would be, because Du Bois was right, race. We have a race issue in this country, and I mean, think about this. The Freedmen's Bureau addressed this issue of vestiture. What is 40 acres and a mule? What is that? That is a government program that I think is tremendously committed to the idea of investiture, that owning property and having an independent means to operate independently. I mean, I see that as actually an admission that vestiture is very, very important in the context of the early Reconstruction.
And honestly, two things, Tim, to listen to you using the term paternalism, I think I immediately go to the Electoral College.
Yep.
I think the creation of the Electoral College, but then I just jump back to ancient Greece and Rome.
Yep.
Because, citizenship was, that investiture within those societies. We talk about that citizenship, but there was a limit to citizenship. And whether you're in Athens or Sparta, or even maybe in ancient Greece or the Roman Republic. So, that idea of this classical republican nature of the philosophy that hopefully the students will be exposed to, that in itself was very limited in a way. And I think the concept of, and I wish I came up with this sentence, I did not, but democratization is preeminently a political process. And so I think that that whole process of growing the democracy, if you will, from the founding era through the framing, through the initial, voting, putting the first government in place under the first Congress, all the way through to where we are now, has been a political process. So I think, and we've had periods of time, David, as you just alluded to, post World War II, where that process has grown. And, there are waves, anti-democratic waves throughout history. You think of the 1920s leading up to World War II and the rise of fascism and fascist governments. You see that in more modern times, pushback.
Well, real quick, the Voting Rights Act to me is specifically about race, which Tim kind of referenced there with Du Bois. Just quickly, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, so here's my dilemma. We have a 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition. So why do we need a Voting Rights Act if we have an amendment that already says that
they're not self-enforcing? They're not self-executing.
I would go back to the case, and I'm going to get this right because I always get it backwards. It's either Reese v. Texas or Texas v. Reese. And the Supreme Court has said that the 15th Amendment does not grant a positive right to vote. And because of that, and, I think I'm just going to jump in here, is that, we have the Civil War. We have the Civil War amendments, or the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and 15. So when you're talking about the Voting Rights Act, we're talking about 14, we're talking about 15. We're also talking about Article 4, right? And the idea of a Republican government guarantee clause. And we're also talking about the 10th Amendment. And this is all going to come to a head in some more modern cases, but we have the Reconstruction period until about 1877, post-Civil War to about 1877, after the Hayes-Tilden debacle, or whatever you want to call it. And then the Northern armies go home. And so during that time period, 1865 to 1877, you see African Americans in Southern states making great gains, being elected to state legislatures, being elected to the national legislature, to Congress. You see these gains being made. And then through home rule and the promises and the deals that were worked out, the Northern armies go home, the Redeemers take control of Southern governments. And then, as you all know, and I'm sure the students will know too, you get laws put in place like, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. And so when this gentleman in Texas was denied the right to vote, as the court said, well, you weren't denied the right to vote because you're African American. You were denied the right to vote because you couldn't pass a literacy test. And even though we know that those are they're not being carried out on a fair basis.
So is it fair to say that
Mike,
even
I guess
though
Mike wanted to jump in, I think.
Well, I just want to, Tim says that amendments are not self-enforcing. So is it fair to say that even though our higher law says you cannot deny this access to voting based upon race, that courts from 1870s on, that courts gave states latitude, all right, to create, I'm trying to think the right word, but to create barriers to voting, all right, as long as they were not specifically race-based.
Yeah,
sure. I mean, Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to bring in here is if we go back to the original Constitution, Tim talked about the founders, framers having a spectrum, being on a spectrum with democracy. There's
Did you
also
say the framers were on the spectrum?
I'm still I have in my notes here that Tim says he's a spectrum guy. I kind of I'm a category guy, he's a spectrum guy. But federalism is a big thing here, right? And the founders set up elections and voting to be largely done by states.
Yep.
And as Chris has alluded to, before the 15th Amendment, Congress had some powers to come in, but not with race specifically. So it's actually that enforcement provision of the 15th Amendment is, in my eyes, what's most important. And those who wrote that, they knew what they were doing. The elections of 66 and 67, right? There was a lot of violence and a lot of things were done keeping blacks away from polls right after the Civil War had ended. And they knew that if the Confederate States were eventually let back in, any law they passed could be undone. So they passed the 15th Amendment, and then what do they immediately do? They passed these acts called the Enforcement Acts in the 1870s, and to give Congress the means to set up agencies to enforce the law. So to me, it's like this step. In the original Constitution, Congress doesn't have a lot of power. They get the power in the 15th Amendment. Then they have to decide, are we going to pass laws pursuant to that power? And the next question is, do you then give resources to the agencies to make sure that you are enforcing that?
Yeah.
And we could talk through all the different ways that kind of ebbs and flows in American history. But by the time we get to 1965, even though Congress has had the power for close to 100 years, it was not being enforced. And Congress felt it needed a law to specifically enforce and set up agencies to make sure that these ways of prohibiting blacks from voting wasn't happening anymore.
So, Chris, what are some of the specific clauses within the Voting Rights Act? How did those clauses specifically try to address some of the problems that Mike was referring to?
Sure. I think probably the one that the students that will encounter the most is Section 4. And Section 4 is in multiple parts. And that's the section known about pre-clearance. And will come up, we'll probably get to Shelby County versus Holder, which is a hugely important Supreme Court case dealing with the Voting Rights Act. But the idea of any area, whether it be a state or a smaller area that has had a history of precluding African Americans from keeping them from the polls, if they need to make any changes in their how they run their elections, could be, I don't know, voter ID, it could be redistricting, it could be any number of things, that they need to go through either a council or a judge in Washington, D.C. to get pre-clearance. So that becomes the enforcement mechanism to continue to make localities, whether they be a municipality, whether it be a county or a state, they have to get that okay from the national government. And then Section 5 is kind of more of the enforcement section of the Voting Rights Act, which would give the Congress the ability to come in and put the smackdown on people from carrying out that stuff. So Sections 4 and 5 are the main things. And really, the Voting Rights Act is a continuation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because you had President Kennedy, though he was very, jump into the history side, he was very reluctant in terms of civil rights. He was much more concerned about the Cold War. He was very worried about being seen as weak on the Russians and communism. He was young, inexperienced, and so he was really trying to think about that front. But then you have young people, riding buses, young people at sit-ins, and young people pushing the envelope. And Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the South, are doing their thing. And so he's having to take this energy away from it. He pushes forward for civil rights. President Kennedy, assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson picks up the mantle. shoves the voting Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. And students, if you want to read about a politician who was good at really knife fighting, really getting stuff done, a serious arm twister, Lyndon Baines Johnson is your man, as these guys well know. I think that voting rights component then was taken out. President Johnson tells civil rights leaders, Dr. King among others, that wait, be patient, be patient. And then eventually you have the follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 64, which is the Voting Rights Act of 65, which is really part two, if you will, of that whole push for civil rights. So sections 4, pre-clearance, section 5, enforcement, and understand, I think it really is safe to say that it is kind of part of the Civil Rights Act of 64.
So, Mike, assess for us if you can, and I want to keep this within a time frame from 65 to 2000. All right, for the next 35 years. What's your assessment of the Voting Rights Act? Do you think it accomplished, what the author's backers had intended and hoped?
Yeah, I think it did actually. I mean, let me just start with the good news. Yes, I think it did. Pause there before I go off on the bad stuff. So let me give the students some things that they should think about. Mississippi was probably considered the worst state in terms of being a Black American and getting the right to vote during the 1960s. In Mississippi in 1965, 6.7% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote. That increased to 59.8% in 1967. So just in a matter of just a couple years, right? In 1964, the whole state of Mississippi had a total of 4 Black Americans who were holding office, who were elected to office. By 1989, it was up to 400. Nationwide, before the Voting Rights Act, it was under 1,000 Black Americans were represented in any elected office, from national down to local. By, I think this is more like 2005, 2010, it was up over 10,000. And another interesting way to think about it is the percentage of Blacks who vote versus the percentage of whites who vote. Even after the Voting Rights Act, there was still a pretty big gap in a lot of states that more percentage of white Americans were voting Black Americans. But by 2012, the year Obama was running for re-election, also a year before Shelby that we're going to talk about, Mississippi, actually, Black Americans as a percentage of the Mississippi population voted at a higher percentage than white Mississippians. So it completely flip-flopped, right? So I think there's no question in terms of getting not just Blacks, but Latinos and as well, but mostly Black Americans, the ability to register to vote and to get them to the polls and to get them the opportunity to actually get elected. I think we see tremendous gains from 65 to 2000 if we're using your time period.
Do you think that it had a significant or more moderate impact on the political landscape of the United States political system?
Much more moderate. And I guess that's the kind of the other side of the story. And let me just pull up, make sure I get these statistics right. Black Americans make up about 12.5% of Americans, but they make up about, and this is as of today, about 10% of the US House, about 8.5% of state legislatures, 5.7% of city councils, and 2% of the Senate. So using those metrics, we could say, even with all these gains we just talked about, looking more macro, as a percentage of the population, Black Americans don't seem to have the same access to power as other Americans. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but I'm wondering, do you see it as a major contributor to what I guess I'll call the realignment of political parties? We're going to talk about political parties in the near future here, but I'm just wondering to what extent does the Voting Rights Act, significantly contribute to what I'll call a realignment, i.e., the Democratic Party becomes predominantly the party of African Americans, and for a while Latinos, and the Republican Party, we'll say is predominantly the party of white Americans. Do you see a connection to the Voting Rights Act in that?
I think it is not coincidental, right, that in 1968 Richard Nixon runs his not so-called, his Southern strategy,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
just that, exactly what you were saying. So yes, it did have this realignment effect. I don't think that takes away from the fact of these amazing gains that were made for many Americans access to political power.
Yeah, let's not make Lyndon Johnson into more noble than he is. I mean, he risks losing white votes in the South, but he's he's now creating a whole new block of voters that are Democratic. And I think, to Mike's point, it starts this slow change of the South becoming more Republican. Absolutely. Yeah.
Chris, I think you have the same reaction I do on that shot at Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, we can't hear you, Chris.
You're on mute.
Oh,
maybe it's best
somebody,
that you're on
somebody
mute.
was mowing outside, so I apologize. I like Lyndon Johnson. I think he was willing to step on a landmine to do the right thing, knowing full well that it's going to cost the Democrats what was known as the Solid South. Now it's the Solid South, thanks to Nixon's Southern strategy. Kids, you can look up a guy named Lee Atwater to talk about that. But not only that, I mean, fast forward to Ronald Reagan. Where does Ronald Reagan give one of his first speeches? In Freedom, Mississippi. Freedom, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were killed in cold blood by members of the Klan because they were registering people to vote. And candidate Reagan gives a speech there and talking about states' rights. I don't think that's a coincidence. And the fact I got to go back to LBJ, being a teacher. He begins his career as a very young man as a teacher of small kids in South Texas, and he has a lot of Hispanic kids too. And so I think he understands what people have been through and the hardships. Now, was he a calculated politician? Yes. I'm not ready to put a halo above LBJ anytime soon. But I think that the fact that he was willing to lose the South to do what I would think that we think of today as the right thing that's fairly noble.
And I think the flip side of this, I mean, and students, you should go and read the history on this as well as what we're telling you. But Lyndon Johnson was not in the mood to pass the Voting Rights Act, and Martin Luther King wasn't really behind. I mean, the march from Selma to Montgomery took place without Martin Luther King being there that first day. So the flip side of LBJ actually getting to a point of doing this, I think we have to think about the young people. I mean, John Lewis was mentioned earlier. John Lewis led that march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he was surrounded by a lot of people that are probably the age of a lot of you students watching this, maybe a little bit older, in your 20s. And it was that kind of public pressure, like kind of wanting the police to get involved so that they could have this spectacle, so that they can then put pressure on Lyndon Johnson to pass the act. I think we can't forget that part of it as well. As much as it was political at the high end, it was really driven by grassroots mobilization down below.
As John Lewis would like to say, good trouble.
Yeah, good trouble.
Good trouble.
So
now, I want to bring in one other aspect too, going back to Kennedy and the political nature at the time. As I mentioned, Kennedy trying to see himself as a Cold Warrior. And, we're in the middle of the Cold War by the mid-50s and into the 60s, 1960 when JFK is elected. And it was really easy for communist nations to, when buses are set on fire with freedom riders and kids sitting at lunch counters are getting beat up because of the color of their skin, it was really easy for communist nations to throw that in our face and say, wait a minute, you're this great democracy. Look how you're treating some of your citizens. So I think that also plays a role as well. And I know we're not talking about Brown versus Board of Education, the seminal case on civil rights, but I think there's pressure in that case to be 9-0 as well because of the Cold War, partly because of the Cold War.
So Tim, going to move here into presentism and more of a philosophical question, I guess.
You're asking me the presentism question.
Yeah, I am. I've got to get you there every now and then.
Good for you.
Have it, poke your head out and look around and see what the world's like. I'm just wondering because I struggle with this a little bit. Do you see every act of a state legislature that regulates voting all right, that i.e. voter ID laws. Do you see every act like that as equivalent to suppressing the vote? Because that is sometimes my feeling, that anytime a state legislature makes any action, there are people automatically say, "Oh, you're trying to suppress the vote." Do you see it that way, or do you think there's some little legitimate laws that states need to pass to make sure that those who are able or have the right to vote are able to, and that there isn't, funny stuff like Chicago in 1960 going on?
Yeah, I have some suspicions about all restrictions equaling deprivation of the right to vote. Now, I guess to me, the analogy is, how many whiskers does it take before it becomes a beard? Is it 500, and then the 501st equals a beard? So I guess I have some suspicions too that legitimate restrictions being caricatured as voting rights deprivation, because frankly, there's you said there's no affirmative right to vote. For better or worse, our system has created the opportunities or the permission for state legislatures to get really creative to find all kinds of exceptions other than race. And they've done quite well at that, frankly. But I do think it's a little ham-handed if we say all voting restrictions equal. Now, here's an interesting thing that happened. I'm actually aware of this happening in my community in Waukesha. When the whole voter ID thing kind of blew up here in Wisconsin, our DMV in our county was pretty much right downtown Waukesha, where all the folks that had a hard time getting IDs, it was pretty proximate for folks to go to the DMV and get an ID. The same year that this was rumbling around, the state moved the DMV way the heck out of town, way the heck out of the way. There were no bus routes out to the DMV. They moved the site of where you could get an ID so inconveniently located for people of poorer means in the state, in the county here of Waukesha. So, let me think about that a second, right? I mean,
that sounds like a beard. That sounds like a beard.
Well, I think we are in the beard zone there, but I mean, as a general principle, I think voter ID, I'm not opposed to that. The devil's in the details of how it's applied. And look at the end results of who winds up not getting to the polls versus the previous year where they were able to get to the polls with IDs.
Mike?
Yeah, in preparing for this, I took a look at the Brennan Center for Justice. I took a look at the brief they sent in for the Shelby County case. And then, and students, when different organizations sending these briefs to Supreme Court, they're kind of coordinating with each other. They're each going to focus on maybe something a little different. But this brief, and we'll put it in the show notes, the resources for you, they really focused on the textual analysis of the 15th Amendment. And they made the strong argument that, and you mentioned this earlier when you read it, David, it's not just deny, it's deny or abridge. And abridge means to lessen. So they make the argument that you don't have to pass things that just deny, it needs to abridge. And then they go through all the case law up to Shelby, and they say, there's a deference to Congress. With Section 2, the courts have always showed Congress a lot of deference on what it means to abridge. And Shelby was one of the first times what the court did in Shelby is they basically said, the way you wrote the act in terms of going in and determining who is going to be under the jurisdiction was outdated, right? It was a technical thing. All Congress has to do is repass. They just have to pass another act, and it, like Shelby wouldn't be relevant. But given that our Congress is so partisan and so dysfunctional, it can't do that, right? We're stuck with it. But this textual analysis of a bridge, I think, is something for the students to think about.
Well, let's deal with that. So I had Mike kind of assess it from 1965 to 2000. I'd like to get your input on what you think the current status of the Voting Rights Act is, because I said somewhat facetiously in our last episode that there's a good question of whether it even exists or not any longer. So I'm wondering about your insight. What do you see as the status of that act in 2023?
And your mute button is there, Chris. If you get out of hand, the mute button.
I will just give you 3 letters. RIP.
So you do think it's if it's not dead, it's near death. It's in a coma.
It's dead.
Well,
it's dead.
Didn't they just this last court session decide? Is it Alabama? That Alabama was in violation of what is it, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? So there's still some
because of the redistricting case. Yeah, the redistricting case. Our current Supreme Court or the Supreme Court, we don't deal with political problems. We don't deal with political issues until we do. Right? Go figure. So yeah, that they might have used that, but I don't know, David. I in my opinion, again, students, this is my opinion. I like to think it's a somewhat informed opinion. It's just a fig leaf at this point in time. But think about this. Clarence Thomas wrote a separate opinion, and we've talked about this case, Shelby County versus Holder, which is really going to gut the Voting Rights Act. Justice Thomas wrote a concurrence where he thought Section 5 in itself was unconstitutional. And Justice Scalia joined to the majority, and this is me ripping a dead guy who said, he was all about deference to Congress. And he said this before, it's not our position as the court to second guess the Congress. Well, in 2006, when they re-upped the Voting Rights Act, it was unanimous in the Senate. There was no dissent in the Senate. It was bipartisan. And so you have you had overwhelming bipartisan support in the House. And yet, in the decision in Shelby, they got it.
Well, did Shelby, the whole thing, or did it deal with just part of the?
Well, Section 4, the pre-clearance, the coverage, right? The coverage and pre-clearance. But by doing that and deferring now to the states, now we see immediately following Shelby, immediately, like days, Abbott in Texas, what is he, the Attorney General in Texas, still, even though he's under indictment, they enacted, in days they enacted voter ID laws. And I want to go back to something Tim was saying, which I think there's an irony here. And Mike, you as a political scientist, you could probably answer this. What were our turnouts percentage-wise in elections? Percentage-wise in national, say presidential or off-year elections? It was pretty. Anytime.
They've generally been around 50%
or less,
right.
less.
Yeah.
So why do we need more restrictions if 50% or less than 50% of the population is actually showing up to the polls? Why do I need to have a voter ID? These are, in my thought process, these are laws in search of crimes. As multiple people have done research, voter fraud is so scant to have any real effect at a state level or a national level, and yet we see a plethora of laws. And one of the first voter ID cases is out of Marion County, Crawford versus Marion County Board of Election back in Indianapolis. If voting is so important, why do so few Americans show up to do it? And 2, if so few Americans show up to do it, why do we need to have more barriers? Just this week, in my state of North Dakota, just a couple of days ago, people presented a possible constitutional amendment to say all ballots must be paper. We won't do electronic voting machines, and all ballots must be turned in by 8 p.m. on election day. So, and more barriers to voting. And I've seen interviews with people that want to perhaps bring back property requirements for voting, or maybe make voting 21 years old or 25 years old, or pass a civics exam. So we're continuing to see more barriers and more barriers to getting to the ballot box.
Are they truly barriers, Chris? Is it a barrier to say the ballot has to be on in at 8 o'clock? Why is that a barrier?
Well, because if you go vote by mail, like maybe, I don't know, do you have a pandemic or something and you want to turn your ballot in by mail? We all know that the postal service is not always that great. So does it have to be postmarked by a certain date or turned in by a certain date?
Yeah.
Or what happens when you close the polls at 6 o'clock and you don't have mail-in ballots? Or what happens when you have mail-in ballots, but you only have one drop box for 2 million people in a certain county in Texas? Those are barriers. And I'm going to go back to Mike's point about the amicus brief by the Brennan Center, a bridge.
Yeah.
Those are abridgments to the right to vote.
Well, most of the democratic world does require voter ID. Why do you see voter ID as a suppression?
Because not everybody has access to an ID.
Our history makes us, I think, especially sensitive to these kinds of we're a half step from the literacy test and the poll tax era with this. And as silly as it might sound for many people, a $10 voter an ID. I mean, that's for some people that's a chunk of change.
And you got to take time off from work. You got to go to daycare. You've got to do all these things. You got to take the bus downtown, or you got to go out to the sticks in Waukesha County. Yeah. And think about this: in the state of North Dakota, we are the only state in the union that you don't have to register to vote, but we do have a voter ID law now.
Well, I mean, I look at Tim's, scenario of Waukesha. The voter ID to me is not a problem because the DMV was going to provide it, But once they moved it, now that now we've got a problem. But the voter ID, if the state's going to provide the ID and hopefully a range of IDs, or they're going to provide for free of charge a specific ID to all people, I don't see a problem.
David,
with that.
My question to you is, why do we need one?
I think it's legitimate that we verify that the person who is voting is who they say they are.
So those thousands of elections we've had prior to these things, where you showed up, you knew the poll worker, you signed your name, you went down to the church, you went down to the school, you went down to wherever you voted. For the thousands of elections we've had without that, have those been a great deal of fraud in those elections? No, there hasn't been. So why do we need ID?
To create a sense of legitimacy in the minds of the people.
I would agree with David. The times are different. And I think, right or wrong, I mean, your point is well taken, Chris, that we've had a lot of elections in this country and they've gone pretty well. But for right now, we're in a really noisy period where, if we can get through this period.
Tim, let me ask you a question. I'm going to cut you off. Has having voter IDs helped this noisy period?
Well, we've only had them for 10, 15 years now, so I don't know how to answer that. I mean, the political scientists might have some numbers on that. But.
Well, I mean, my goodness, we're in the middle of something we've never been in before, when a former president has been charged with fraud for trying to circumvent the election.
Right.
And has voter
I think we're running far afield of the issue at hand here on.
No, we're not, because you're talking about legitimacy of elections. You're talking about voter ID providing the legitimacy of elections, and people are not accepting the legitimacy of the elections, and they've been lied to about this fraud. And look where we are. That hasn't calmed fears for people.
Well, I don't know that ID is going to help those folks either, frankly, but I think legitimacy of elections is important, and we're just in a time period where it's different.
Again, I'm sorry to cut you off, but when did elections become illegitimate?
Well, that's a good question, because I don't think I think, Chris, you're probably right in a more modern sense, but we've got electoral shenanigans and things going on in our lifetime that we wouldn't tolerate today. I think that in state elections, things were going on in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that we wouldn't tolerate today, and they weren't really policed quite as well as they are. So
I think some of those examples are it's apples and oranges. I mean, like before we had a secret ballot, when you had to walk in public and put your red or blue, everyone knew how you voted, right? Now, you make a rule and you say, now you get to go behind a curtain and it's a secret ballot. is that lessening your right to vote? Is that making it harder to right to vote? Or is it only enhancing? That's a clear reform that enhances elections. That's very different than without. I'm with Chris on this. This is all these reforms are reforms looking for a problem, and there are problems that have been created in the media to justify the reforms, which are not responding to a real problem. There is no widespread voter fraud happening in the United States because people don't have IDs. That is simply not what's happening. So the only, like, we have to act like, we kind of have to put on blinders and act like we don't understand American history and have this like legitimate, like without cracking up kind of debate about, oh, isn't this a good idea? Yeah, maybe in a different planet with a different history. But given that our history is just replete with certain sections of the population being denied rights and being denied access to power, and to pretend now that we have it all figured out and these reforms make complete rational sense, I just think it just yeah, it just doesn't make sense. Like, we have to understand the history. And
So I'm assuming therefore you're not a supporter of your guy Vivek Ramaswamy's idea. Chris, I think, mentioned it, of requiring a civic literacy test for 18 to 25-year-olds. You would be.
He may not pass it though, right? I mean,
I'm in support of that test for people running for office, because during the debate, the same guy that's proposing that said he thought the Constitution did a great, without, I'm paraphrasing, the Constitution helped us win the American Revolution. And when I shared that with Tim immediately said, "Oh, you mean the Articles of Confederation?" So this is the same guy that's proposing that idea.
yeah, I'm not in favor of that kind of test. I think it's something I think the students could actually sit and ask themselves, what would the reason for that test be? And if you're going to have a test, do you want something for people to memorize? Or I don't see how that, I think that just like moves the focus someplace else, because now we're worried that people are voting, but they're not, I don't know, they don't know enough to vote. That's a whole separate problem, whether you don't have an ID. It's just another way to slow people down from voting. Now, what I have been thinking about that is worrisome, I don't think there should be a separate test for this, but misinformation is just this is going to be a century where we're just going to see this become more and more prevalent, right? With AI now, where you can make mock videos, make mock voices, make up articles. You can go into ChatGPT and you can ask it to write anything you want and give you sources. That worries me. It worries me that voters are misinformed about issues. I don't have a problem with a voter having access to information and maybe not understanding it, I guess. I have an issue with people being misinformed and voting based on that misinformation. I don't think there's a test for that. I think that's something we need to be doing in our communities and our schools that's separate from a separate test. But that does worry me. And I would love to hear the students' ideas on what do we do as a society as we're looking in the face of all this misinformation.
Two things here. And one, for the students watching this and for the teachers, I wonder how many "We the People" statements might be generated by ChatGPT. Two, I just had a little flashback when John Patrick was a retired professor at Indiana University, and one of the founding fathers of this program, was working with some of my students on this very issue. And I just watched him so nice and sweetly back a couple of my students into a corner about voting. And he got them to say, yes, there should be a test for voting, like a literacy test. And I'm just sitting in the back of the room doing this, shaking my head. And Dr. Patrick just set the trap, and these two young men just walked right into it. So, I mean, think about what we're talking about. A test for voting. Been there, done that. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? How many beans in a jar? The last literacy test was given in Louisiana in the early 1960s, designed not to be able to be passed. So the idea, would we And the question becomes, do we want more voters or do we want more informed voters? And that's, I think, what Mike is speaking to in terms about that misinformation.
Right. Well, again, as always, time is our enemy. So we'll turn to tradition, and I'll ask each of our scholars to provide some insight, recommendation on, or to teachers and students as far as how they might approach this question. So, Professor Moore, what say you?
Alexander Keesar. He wrote a book called The Right to Vote: The Contested History of American Democracy. It's maybe 20 years now that since it's been published, but it's still a really good survey of the contested history of voting in America. And it's especially good too, because it's not just on the deprivation of the right to vote for African Americans, but it also how the deprivation of the right to vote for other groups, Northern immigrants too, are in his book, in his story. So I think it's a must read for this question, because it's a great survey, leading up to this whole thing's made me uncomfortable because we're 1965 and on. But I think the good teams are going to have some history, and Keesar's book is great.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, that's a great book recommendation. The part B of the question asking what's currently still going on, students, you may be in a community where this is not an issue, right? I would encourage you to seek out the voices of people who recently, like in the last election, were denied the right to vote. I would listen to their stories. I would seek out the articles that they've written. And even the people who are working at voting stations who are now never going to, like the pressure they're coming under to administer elections. I think that's another angle here. I don't know. I'm speaking for a lot of the students at my university who I teach. That part of the question, a lot of them are just not going to have a lot of like lived experience of knowing someone who showed up to vote and were told they couldn't because of something, right? Or a polling booth moved and they couldn't vote. So I would encourage you to look for those stories, and you could find them to give you some lived experiences, so you could really think about what it's like for those individuals, and then maybe what we need to do to make it easier.
Chris?
Oh my gosh, how much time do I have? Not much.
A minute.
Yeah. I just heard on NPR today that former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, and a federal prosecutor at one time is held liable for, or he's going to be having to pay for what he's attacked two poll workers with misinformation. We're struggling to get people to work the polls, nonpartisan positions. I mean, think about what that says, where we are as a nation right now because of misinformation. And to me, this is honestly very, very troubling. I go back to Shelby County and Chief Justice John Roberts, and the indication that we're in a post-racial society. Somehow we don't need this anymore, even though Congress, a bipartisan support, re-upped it. And yet, just this last weekend, a person went into a Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida, to gun down people because they were African American. And I would go to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent. She, when we got rid of the Voting Rights Act, she said it's like getting rid of your umbrella just because it's not raining right now. I think it's raining right now. I think it's really raining right now. And I think this is a concern that if you're worried about the future of the nation, I think this is a concern for young people. And I'm hoping that you guys save us from my generation and what we have done. Because if we can't get people to work the polls, how are we going to run elections? And if we're going to question the validity of elections, even though we have voter ID, even though we put these other speed bumps in the way of things, and people are still going to question these elections, what does the future hold? So I'm hoping that the students watching this will figure this out. And I'm sorry to rant on this, but this really gets under my skin.
Well, the only thing I would add, and I'm somewhat reticent because I don't like to, guide students into a lot of case law, but I think with this question that you have to be very familiar with Shelby County and Baranovich that dealt with, I think, Section 5, or I can't remember which section of the Voting Rights Act, but that was a couple of years ago. But look at the dissents as well in those voting rights cases there, because I think they really, knowing the majority decision of dissent really helps frame, I think, a lot of discussion on this question in and of itself. Well, we hope Mr. Kavanaugh, yes, sir.
Sorry. Moore v. Harper. More v. Harper from this last term of the court. Yeah. We'll put a link in resources. That is a huge case as well.
Yep. Yes. Always check our resource section there as we're trying to give you extra help, and we've given you some insight into the Voting Rights Act, and we'll look forward to seeing students and teachers in our next session. I believe we may be talking about political parties. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye bye. Bye bonds.